You reach toward your dog, maybe to pet him, maybe to hug him, maybe simply to get closer. And then something small happens: a quick nose lick, a yawn, a slow blink. Most people barely notice it. The interaction continues. Nothing dramatic happens. Your dog stays where he is. Maybe he even looks relaxed. And that is usually why these moments are so easy to miss. Many owners assume that if a dog is uncomfortable, the signs should be obvious. A dog should move away, leave the room, or clearly refuse the interaction. But in many cases, that is not how it starts. Some dogs communicate much more quietly than that. A brief pause before leaning back, a slight turn of the head, a blink that lasts just a little longer than usual. Tiny changes that can disappear almost as quickly as they appear. And because they seem so small, people often treat them as random habits, something the dog simply does, nothing more. Sometimes that interpretation may miss an important part of what the dog is trying to communicate, because these subtle behaviors can appear before avoidance ever becomes visible, long before a dog gets up and walks away. And once you begin noticing those early moments, the entire interaction can start to look a little different. What many people notice first is the moment the dog creates distance. He gets up, walks away, moves to another spot in the room, and that is usually the behavior people remember. But dogs do not always begin there. In many situations, the first signs are much quieter. A brief pause when a hand reaches toward them, a quick glance away, a small shift in posture. Sometimes the dog stays exactly where he is, which makes the signal even easier to overlook, and that can lead to a common misunderstanding. People often assume that because the dog remained close, he must have felt completely comfortable. But proximity and comfort are not always the same thing. Many dogs will try to communicate before they choose to leave, not because something is seriously wrong and not because they dislike the person. Often, they may simply be trying to make the interaction feel a little less intense from their perspective. That is why these early signals matter. They can appear while the dog is still engaged, still nearby, still participating in the interaction. The leaving, when it happens, often comes later, and one of the most commonly missed signals may be the simplest of all. You can see the code in our conversation history. One of the easiest signals to miss is a quick lick of the nose. It happens fast, sometimes so fast that people only notice it when watching a video back later. There is no food involved, no treat in sight, no obvious reason for it at all, just a brief movement of the tongue during an interaction. And because it seems so ordinary, most owners never pay much attention to it. What makes this signal interesting is the timing. It may appear right as someone reaches toward the dog, leans over him, moves closer, or begins an interaction that feels slightly intense from the dog's perspective. Not every nose lick means discomfort. Dogs lick their noses for many different reasons. Context always matters, but when the behavior appears together with other subtle signals, the picture can start to change. The dog may not be asking to end the interaction, at least not necessarily. Sometimes he may simply be trying to make the situation feel a little easier to navigate, a little calmer. And once you start noticing when these nose licks happen, another behavior often becomes easier to recognize as well: the yawn that appears when a dog is not tired at all. Yawning is one of those behaviors that people think they already understand. A dog yawns. He must be tired. The explanation feels obvious, but sometimes the timing tells a different story. You may see a dog yawn in the middle of the day, wide awake, alert, watching everything around him, and yet the yawn appears just as a person leans closer, reaches out, or begins a more direct interaction. That does not automatically mean the dog is stressed. And it certainly does not mean every yawn has a hidden meaning. Dogs yawn for many reasons. The important part is the context. What happened immediately before it? What happened immediately after? Those questions are often more useful than the yawn itself. In many cases, owners notice the behavior but not the situation surrounding it. The yawn becomes the focus. The interaction that triggered it is forgotten. But behavior rarely exists by itself. It is usually connected to something happening around the dog at that moment. And sometimes the yawn may be one small clue that the interaction feels a little more intense than it appears. Not intense enough for the dog to leave, not intense enough for a strong reaction, just enough for a subtle signal. Um, and some dogs have another way of handling those moments. Instead of leaving, they begin creating a little distance while staying exactly where they are. Not every dog responds to discomfort by walking away. In fact, many dogs try something much smaller first. They stay in the interaction, they stay in the room, but they begin changing the way they engage with it. You may notice a slow blink, a gentle turn of the head, or a sudden interest in sniffing the floor nearby. At first glance, these behaviors can look unrelated. The dog seems distracted. Maybe he noticed a scent. Maybe he is simply looking somewhere else. And sometimes that is exactly what is happening. But context matters here too. If these behaviors appear during a social interaction, they may be serving a different purpose. The dog remains close, yet he slightly reduces the intensity of the moment, almost as if he is creating a little more breathing room without actually increasing physical distance. That is one reason these signals are so easy to miss. The dog has not left. Nothing dramatic has happened. The interaction is still continuing. Many owners only notice communication when it becomes obvious, but some of the most important signals appear while the dog is still participating, still listening, still staying near. Which raises an interesting question. Are these small behaviors really random habits, or are they part of a larger pattern that dogs use during social interactions? What makes these observations especially interesting is that researchers have examined some of these behaviors quite closely. A study published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior looked at appeasement signals during interactions between dogs and people. Researchers focused on behaviors such as lip licking and looking away during social situations. Their findings suggested these behaviors may serve as appeasement signals in dog human communication, yeah, particularly in situations that involve a higher level of social tension. That does not mean a nose lick always has one specific meaning, or that every head turn should be interpreted in the same way. Behavior is rarely that simple, but the study supports an important idea. Some of the small signals owners often dismiss may actually be part of communication, not communication that is loud or dramatic, communication that is quiet, subtle, easy to miss if you're only watching for obvious reactions. And that may explain why many people notice the final outcome but overlook everything that happened before it. The dog leaves, the dog turns away, the dog creates distance. Those behaviors get our attention, but the conversation may have started much earlier, with signals that lasted only a second or two. This is where many well meaning owners run into a small misunderstanding. The dog licks his nose, looks away for a moment, yawns, or begins sniffing the ground. But because those signals seem so minor, the interaction continues exactly as before. A person moves a little closer, keeps petting, calls the dog back when he starts creating distance, not because they are doing anything wrong, usually because they believe the dog is comfortable. After all, he is still there. He has not walked away. He has not refused the interaction. So there appears to be no reason to change anything. But sometimes the dog has already started communicating. The signals were simply quieter than expected. And when those early signals go unnoticed, they often become more noticeable over time. The dog turns away more often, moves farther from the interaction, or eventually gets up and leaves altogether. That is usually the moment people remember, the moment that feels important. Yet in many cases, the more useful information appeared earlier, in the pause, in the glance away, in the nose lick that lasted less than a second. And once you begin paying attention to those smaller moments, something interesting happens. You often have the chance to understand your dog's comfort level before the interaction reaches that final stage. The next time you interact with your dog, try a small experiment. Do not watch for the moment he walks away. Watch for what happens before that. A quick nose lick, a yawn that appears in the middle of an interaction, a slow blink, a slight turn of the head, a sudden pause to sniff the ground. Individually, these behaviors may not mean very much. Dogs are complex, and any single signal can have more than one explanation. That is why context is always important. What matters is the pattern, the timing, the way several small behaviors appear together during the same interaction. You may start noticing moments that previously seemed invisible, moments when your dog remains close, yet quietly changes the way he is participating. And sometimes that small shift in perspective can change the entire interaction. Not because you stop showing affection, not because you become overly cautious, but because you begin noticing communication that was already there. The signals were never hidden, they were simply quieter than most people expect. And learning to see those quieter moments may be one of the simplest ways to better understand how your dog experiences the world around him.